Wisconsin Eye's 2014 election coverage is brought to you by the Wisconsin Hospital Association. For over 90 years, a valued voice for Wisconsin hospitals, supporting high-quality, high-value care in communities like yours.
Wisconsin Eye is at the Neenah Public Library interviewing candidates in 2014 elections. We're interviewing Representative Gordon Hintz of Oshkosh. He's a Democrat. He's seeking re-election in the 54th Assembly District. Gordon, welcome back to Wisconsin Eye.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Programming note, Wisconsin Eye appreciates the support of the Wisconsin Hospital Association, which represents more than 139 hospitals and health systems, for making these candidate interviews possible. Seeking fourth term? Gordon?
Fifth term, actually.
Sorry, I was wrong.
Yeah.
Well, you're kind of with that tenure, you're kind of a senior statesman. Let me begin the interview this way. If you're reelected, what do you think should be the top one or two priorities of your party in the Assembly next session?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of it's going to depend upon what happens with the governor's race. I think the majority in the Assembly is probably going to continue, although the gap, I hope, is a little closer. But it looks like we very well could have a budget deficit, and balancing those priorities between further spending cuts or looking at some revenue options is something that's going to into the next budget. Transportation is one of the big ones. We've now had a couple years where we've known about the problem, but it's really time for action, and whoever the next governor is going to have to lead the way. But we're going to need some sensible people in the legislature that recognize that we're done kicking the can down the road, that probably needs to be a new revenue source. But there's also, as Democrats, we spend sometimes the challenge is the agenda is being driven by the majority party, and a lot of times we're trying to prevent these things from happening or improve them or make them better. The challenge there is sometimes we're not talking about all the other issues that need to be addressed. Student loan reform is something that we started getting out there, but there's some issues that in the first term of Governor Walker you don't hear anything about energy. Even though Minnesota and Iowa are at 20% and 18% of their wind energy, and we're at 2%.
Renewables? Yeah.
You bet. That we still pay $15 billion a year to Illinois to import energy instead of producing it here. Those kind of issues have sort of been off the table, and I think there's some things that we can do as a state. Corrections reform. There seems to be more outside interest in addressing things, but it's really outside of repealing some of the initiatives that we did under Governor Doyle. There's really been no action on that, and for such a big ticket budget item, I think there's some room for Democrats to hopefully lead the way. If you look at some of the more successful bipartisan initiatives in the last term, both in terms of expanding the venture capital bill and the focus on mental health, I think those are things that when the Democrats were in the majority that we pushed that started to get some bipartisan traction. And I'm happy with that. I was glad to see that mental health was not a partisan issue, and that everybody recognized that it should be on equal footing with physical health.
Well, let's work through some of these issues quickly. I've got a list here. Let's talk about funding public schools if there's a deficit. Should that be the top priority? If there's a deficit, there may not be enough money for a new school aid formula. What are your thoughts on funding K-12?
Right. I mean, you got to govern with the hand that you have, but I think we have to look at the fact that this is part of the problem when you make election year tax cuts your priority, and you spend money on money that you think you're going to have on tax cuts that put us in this position. Would it be fair to revisit some of those things as a way to restore the budget cuts? Mm-hmm. That was, if that's responsible for it. They didn't do it at the federal level, but tax cuts were a big part of the deficit we have out there. Look, few things are more important than public education. I do think the status quo isn't good enough. I think we do have to look at some formula changes, but there's sort of some moving parts here. The voucher expansion has been ineffective, unaccountable, and reckless, I think, and not a good use of taxpayer money.
Would you stop vouchers and choice from statewide right now they're statewide with a 1,000 student cap. What would you push for in the next budget in terms of vouchers?
That would eliminate, I would repeal the statewide.
Even in the two urban cities in Milwaukee and Racine?
No, I think I would have to go back in Racine. Because they're only in year 3, and quite frankly, I think it's been a disaster there. In communities like mine, and the statewide average is that 70% of them were already paying private tuition. So it's not like, so essentially 70% of the people won't be impacted. They just won't have the taxpayers paying for, their private tuition. If this keeps expanding and we have 2 separate systems and we see, it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where, self-selection of which students go into private schools, defund, the public schools, and to the point where even, the perception and the morale of these institutions, goes further down, and they'll keep expanding things to the point where, we'll have 2 education systems, that neither of which serve what our constitutional requirement of providing an equal opportunity education to all kids is in our state.
Governor Walker recently called for the repeal or withdrawal from the Common Core standards. What's your position on that?
I think it's ridiculous. Can the governor make a single decision without running for president? We've seen it time after time. I concur with Luther Olson. I go to the CISA 6 meetings with him where we hear, from educators and from administrators, and few issues seem to have a different perception and reality than the Common Core. And I'm not going to say that we have to be an expert here, and I'm always skeptical of the federal government's requirements, but on this one, things are really decided at the local level, and districts have had those inputs, and a lot of, I think everybody wants a Wisconsin-based solution, and that's what we have. So this is more silly politics, and I think anything that happens while President Obama's in office seems to be, toxic for Republicans to even think about supporting.
Taxpayer Alliance, and you alluded to it, said one of the most difficult decisions involving funding transportation. Did you say we have to look for a new source? Are you interested in raising the gas tax or the $75 vehicle fee?
I'll tell you what I don't support first, and that is using general fund dollars. Just like we shouldn't use transportation borrowing to pay for general fund programs, we shouldn't use general fund money to pay for transportation programs. And that's what we've done in the last 2 budgets. And my guess is that's what Governor Walker would do if he was reelected. He would take the sales tax probably from new vehicle sales and move that over. And that's $1 billion. But that comes at the expense of the UW system, the expense of K-12 education. I think it's going to have to be a bipartisan solution because of the difficult politics of it. When I surveyed my constituents, they said they weren't fans of new revenue and they would support cutting projects, but we all know that when the potholes start and when infrastructure falls behind, it's one of the most important investments we can make, not just from a public safety standpoint, but here in the Fox Valley, we move goods and services that are made here, that go through the Milwaukee interchange and the zoo interchange, and so safety and efficiency are important. I think we do need to go back to consider, going back to indexing. But I also think we can be creative with some things. As someone whose county is littered with the most unseemly billboards, I think we should maybe look at a billboard assessment. They're the ones profiting off public investment in infrastructure. And earlier, I looked at how many we have in the state, and quite frankly, again, they're profiting off this public investment. Shouldn't we capture some of that? Now, that's not going to pay for the whole thing, but I think it's a start. So don't use general fund dollars. Look at alternative options. Maybe we need to look at things like vehicle miles traveled. But I thought the Governor's Commission did a good job of laying out the very real challenges. And, we have to lead and govern, and that's, we haven't done that so far.
Okay. A question on healthcare. The American Hospital Association, says that our Medicaid reimbursement rates are the second lowest in the nation. Do you think those will need to be increased in the next budget, Gordon?
I think we seriously should look at doing it. I think the first thing we should do is take the federal Medicaid dollars so we can maximize the pot of money that we have, which would make it a lot easier for us to increase reimbursement rates, whether it's nursing homes, whether it's hospitals, the hidden tax, as the Hospitals Association, others call it. The cost shift that goes on is having an impact on our costs, and it really is unfair. to have such a low reimbursement level that hasn't been changed in a while. But it also is a big state expenditure that it's got to be a balancing act. But we know what the impact is, for instance, on dental care of low reimbursement. And I think it is time we consider that. I think if the governor would take the federal Medicaid dollars for the expansion, there'd be more support for increasing reimbursement, even if the coverage was somewhere between what it was 2 years ago and what the governor has proposed now, meaning maybe you don't cover the full 200% of the poverty line, but you raise reimbursement rates. I think there was a compromise to be had there. But the first thing to do is maximize the funding available.
There was a bill last session. There'll be another bill introduced next session on medical marijuana, and that travels with the issue in light of Colorado and Washington on recreational making recreational use legal. To your positions?
Medicinal marijuana, something that I've supported for a while now. I know we had a bill. It didn't come to a vote, but I certainly told then Representative Pocan, that I would support it. It was narrower than some of the other states in terms of what it covered. It makes a lot of sense, and we should do that. I think a lot of states like Wisconsin are watching what happens in Colorado and Washington. I certainly don't support it from a new revenue standpoint. I always think that we shouldn't get caught up in that. But I think we should start looking at decriminalizing things that, like marijuana possession. In fact, most counties now don't prioritize on it or charge it out at something much less. This is one of those ones where the arguments against legalization are actually not very good. That being said, there are some unknowns, and any time that you give legal status to something, you're effectively endorsing it, and that means for kids too. And I do have some concerns about what message it sends to high school kids that this is something that's okay. And people make the argument, well, what about alcohol and everything? Well, yeah, but that doesn't make it because it's either equal or worse, necessarily a good thing. And I think there's some unintended consequences in there. But in general, are we seeing an evolution in policy that should happen? Yes. Are we seeing an evolution in the public in their opinion on it? Yes. And I think policies will reflect that. But I think we want to take a comprehensive approach to what it means when we say we're going to legalize it. So,
do you want to revisit the bill that passed early last session that let Gogebic taconite potentially apply for a open pit iron permit in Ashland and Iron counties?
Sure. I mean, I think what we did was bad. I still don't think it will ultimately happen. Maybe not just because, of the federal government, but also because of the economics. I spent a lot of time up there last session, meeting with the company. I learned a lot from the CEO, meeting with geologists, meeting with the tribes, touring the area. And just from an economic standpoint, I mean, this has been there for a while, and companies have made the decision not to mine it because it just wasn't cost effective. And I still think the economics might not be there for it to happen, but you should always be really cautious when you give away the farm. And I think it sets a dangerous precedent for perhaps enabling other kind of mining, and we know that we're probably going to have some bills, on frac sand mining and some other things. But especially with the more recent news, never has there been more transparent, where a private company has come in and got everything they wanted at the expense of a formal process and protections for our environment. So. Yeah, I'd certainly want to revisit it because I don't think you should ever have that kind of expanses enabling legislation that removes basic protections for conservation in our state.
You mentioned frac sand mining. There was a bill drafted that would set statewide standards, kind of preempt local governments. Who should have the power to
And it's a great question. And because it came when it did, and who the sponsor was, I think, was involved with the mining bill. I differ somewhat. I think the state has fallen behind. Frac sand mining has expanded so fast, and it's more obviously in the western part of the state, but state regulations haven't kept up. I do think that we should have some sort of state standards, but it can't be rushed through like I felt that it was, and there's got to be more discretion given to local governments in terms of what they can control. So I guess I am trying to have it both ways. I think the state should have an interest in terms of what sort of mining happens and what you can and can't do. But when I hear about things like trucks at 3 in the morning and 24-hour, those kind of ordinances, pollution, noise, local governments shouldn't give that up. And I certainly supported their opposition of the bill at the time because it's been such a bad 4 years for local control, and this seemed like it was another one that was going to steamroll their rights.
Okay. It was an issue in the Democratic primary for Attorney General. First offense drunken driving, should it be a crime, Gordon?
I think when most of us say, should drunk driving be a crime, just from anybody that gets in their car that does that, should understand the consequences of it, and it is a very serious issue. That being said, as a policymaker, I think you have to take a step back and say, is the goal of this to save lives? Is it the best use of resources? What are the consequences, both direct and unintended? I'm open to looking at it, but it's kind of like the death penalty. It's one of those issues where the death penalty is not a deterrent, and it may be that criminalizing first offense is also not a deterrent, but it stacks up our courts, it drives up costs, it has other impacts. Well, if it's not a deterrent, but we want these people to be held accountable, is that still the best rational policy-wise? So it's something we're going to discuss for a while. Obviously, we have serious issues in the state, and it's one that ed boards and others rally around. But as policymakers, I think you have to take a step back and look at what kind of effect is this going to have, if any, and why are we doing it? And
then finally, do you want to highlight any differences with you and your opponent on November 4?
I show up. He's already skipped our first debate that he set. I've never met him, so he's sort of the snuffleupagus of assembly candidates. But I look forward to that. In contrasting, I think elections about incumbents should be about incumbents. And I'm proud to run on my record and think I've got a lot of work to continue. And I think, given the turnover in the legislature, I've got an important role to play. But I have no idea, because I don't think he's taken any positions in anything. But when he does, I look forward to debating those.
Thank you. State Representative Gordon Hintz of Oshkosh is a Democrat seeking re-election in the 54th Assembly District. Gordon, thanks for talking to Wisconsin Eye.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.